All right, great. Live stream preparing. Let me get you guys up here. Got lots of people want to join the video panel. I'm only put a few on at once and then try it. Participants. Cool. So Brendan, Denis. All right, cool. Denis, I'm gonna put you, or Dennis, we'll put you up. How's it going, Brendan? Got you on mute. Can you speak now?
Yes, good.
Cool. All right, great. Well, thank you for joining us. So we're going to talk today about learning multiple languages at once. So I'm going to mute this here. And those of you in the YouTube chat, I got much stuff going on here. Feel free to ask your questions there. And Brendan, I want to start off with you just to get the conversation going. Are you someone who's interested in learning multiple languages at once? Have you tried in the past?
Yeah, what happened was I was studying German for quite a while, but I didn't make it to what you call the shift, and then I ended up moving to Italy. So now I'm learning Italian, of course, to converse with the locals, and I don't want to lose all the German I studied. And plus, I have a third language I'm trying to maintain.
Gotcha.
So I guess of the two, I'd rather just, I guess I could sacrifice the German, but I don't want to lose the one I already have. But I want to continue, learning the Italian. I'm just trying to figure out a good way to break up my study time between the two.
Gotcha. Yeah, cool. So that's what I was expecting. So before, people would ask me, how do I learn multiple languages at once? And I was interpreting that question as, maybe someone doesn't know any languages or whatever they are, and they say, oh, I want to learn Arabic and French and Chinese all at the same time. I'm like, well, how'd you do that? Like, just choose one, focus on it, and then once you get to that good point, move to the next one. And then I realized as people were asking this question more, it's actually a more complicated question. So in the case of Brendan, there's a couple of things going on. One is you started a language, but then you didn't get to the point where you felt satisfied with it yet, where it kind of shifted in your mind and you're comfortable in conversation. And then your life circumstances brought you to a different place of the world where you now had a necessity to learn something else. So you didn't want to lose that progress. So that's one language there. You still need to engage in the society you're in. That's the second language there. And then there's this other issue of a third language that you actually did get to a comfortable point with, but there's a concern of it kind of receding and being lost in the past. Right. Is that all correct?
That's correct.
Great. Cool. Thank you. I'm going to ask, is it Dennis?
Yes. Ici on dit Denis à Montréal.
Cool. All right, Denis, there. Great. So I know you're in Quebec right now, you're in Montreal, learning French. Do you have other language you're trying to learn at the same time, or have you been trying to learn multiple languages before?
Well, I had grown up learning Spanish at home and at school, secondary school. So my Spanish was good. So Spanish was my first introduction to a foreign language. Then I was introduced to French. So at one time I was actually learning French and practicing my Spanish at the same time. And several years afterwards, I was in another country where, interestingly enough, I was exposed to both Hebrew and Finnish simultaneously. So, it was a case of, learning Hebrew and being exposed to Finnish, which is quite a contrast. So I have been exposed to 4 foreign languages: Finnish, Hebrew, Spanish, and French. What I found with me is that because I've been more exposed to Spanish and to some French, because I had studied French before, is that there were times when I'm speaking Spanish and then I'm thinking French, and vice versa. So I would be speaking French or attempting to speak French, and thinking and saying Spanish words. So that has been my experience.
Yes, cool. Great. So that's good. You guys kind of brought up all the main points I wanted to cover in this conversation. So as we mentioned with Brendan, there's an idea of, he mentioned the idea of the shift, which is, you can also think of that as a checkpoint. And that's for me, what I consider the point we want to sprint towards when you're learning a new language. And that's related to this idea of maintenance, or more specifically, the idea of losing a language. So the idea is that obviously when you don't use it, you lose it. However, the speed at which you lose something depends at the level of achievement and fluency you already achieved. So we'll go into more details about that. And then Dennis was talking about interference. So if you're exposed to multiple things at once, maybe you're trying to speak in French, but then your mind is still on a Spanish thing. It might blend into your speaking. It might blend into your thinking. And then that can become problematic as well. And then there's a general idea, which Brendan mentioned, which is how do I divide up my time? So I'm in this environment, exposed to this language. I want to maintain this one, but I don't want this one to interfere. I have these many hours of practice. How should I divide all this up? So that's the kind of what we're dealing with right here. I want to move over to the YouTube live and see, you got a couple of people here. Those of you watching YouTube live in the chat, let me know, what is your experience or your desires or your goals learning multiple languages? What are your thoughts on it? What would you like to discuss in this call? If anything you have to say about this issue, please drop it in here. And in the meantime, I'm going to continue the conversation. I'm also going to ask, actually, we got space for more people here. If you, those of you who are on Zoom who want to join and share your own stories, raise your hand again, because I lost the last hand raise. Anyone who wants to come on and talk about? Yeah, cool. Brian, anyone else? Nikki? Great, yeah, so I'm gonna ask Brian and Nikki what their situations are, and then we'll launch into a full-fledged conversation about how to deal with these issues. Cool, someone here in YouTube chat's talking about rapping in multiple languages, which we all, of course, aim for. The most important thing to learn is how to rap in multiple languages. Great, cool. So Nikki, are you guys on here? Gallery view. Nikki, you're on mute. Let me unmute you. Right. So you can say that again. You're on mute.
Sorry, I missed that.
Oh yeah, you were speaking, but you're on mute. So just repeat whatever you were saying before.
When I go to Turkey, I need Kormanji Kurdish, Zazaki, and Turkish. So I'm trying to keep, at the moment, I'm trying to learn Zazaki because I still have grammar to learn. Keep up Kormanji and increase my vocabulary, mostly by reading. And gradually improve my Turkish, which is worse than the others because I don't use it so much. But my Kurdish dictionaries are Kurdish Turkish, so I need it for that apart from anything else.
Can you go into a bit more detail about so you use all three of these languages when you're traveling there, and what are the different contexts where you'd use each one?
Most of my friends are Kurds and most of them speak Kurmanji, so I need that. So I get plenty of practice talking it. Some are Zaza, and it's a moot point whether Zaza are Kurds or not, so I won't argue with that. But I'm learning Zazaki, which is very similar to Kurmanji. But I haven't been learning it for a year yet, so conversation, it happens, but the person I'm talking to needs to be very patient. And of course, most people in Turkey are actually Turks and don't know Kormanji or Zazaki. So things like buying bus tickets, going shopping, it's polite to try to know some Turkish.
Gotcha. Okay, so if I understand correctly, when you go to Turkey, the main group of people with whom you're, establishing connection and conversation are going to be, Kurdish or this Zazaki group of people, and you're going to be using either of those two languages primarily in those conversations. However, the greater cultural context you're within is Turkish. So when you're actually transacting and getting around, that's the lingua franca really of.
Yeah.
So all three of those are going to be relevant to what you're doing with your language goals. Is that correct?
Yes.
Cool. That's great. So we'll get back to you. You brought up another important concept here, which is, we'll say different from Brendan's case, where he learned one language in this part of the world. Now he's in Italy, and they speak Italian there or whatever they speak there. This issue of within the same geographic area, people speaking multiple different things. So I find that very interesting when you have, on one sense, you have the higher level lingua franca that everyone kind of knows, but then you want to have a more deeper, intimate connection with a specific person, a group of people, then you go kind of a layer down. And in fact, that might actually be relevant to you, Brandon, in Italy, because then you also have the dialects of in Italy, essentially like Sicilian or whatever, right? So cool, we'll get into that and my thoughts on how those things kind of mix together. And then I'll ask as well, who else joined us here? Someone else joined us here. Brian. So I'm gonna bring up Brian now and then ask you about your situation, and then we'll go from there.
Hello.
Yes.
I'm Brian, and I'm really been trying to learn German. I've also and for my German history courses, and I've also taken French, beginning French 1 and 2, and French conversation, and I've also taken beginning Spanish 1 and 2 just for fun. But basically, for my studies, I really need to master German and ideally French as well. And I've kind of gotten behind on trying to emphasize the German, and I don't want to lose the French especially.
When you say for your studies, is it a thing where you're going to be tested on either or both of these languages at some point in the future?
When I apply for a .12 program, the professors of the committee will want to know, especially that if I can read German, and obviously I have to speak it. And most history .12 programs require that you know a second language. So when it comes to German history, French is usually the best one.
Okay, second one aside from German.
What was that again?
When you say they require you to learn a second language as a second language on top of German, right?
That's right, yes.
Gotcha. And then when they say that you need to know a second one on top of German, usually French, know it to what degree? Is that a thing to be tested on, or like, what level you need to achieve there? Or
as I understand it, yes, I will be tested on it. Probably not quite to the same degree as German, because obviously with German history, you should know German. Read books in German and read documents in German. So French won't be, I guess, tested as hard, you could say. But from what I've read, they usually want a second language in there.
Sure. Okay.
And of course, I took a little bit of Spanish, mainly for fun, since I'm not going to use Spanish in German history. I was just curious about it. I live in Florida, Jacksonville, Florida. And you hear Spanish every so often. So I just took it for fun.
Gotcha. Okay. Cool. Great. This is good. I think we have a good diverse group of goals and challenges and ambitions here. Give us a whole round of discussion. I'm just gonna quickly read through these YouTube comments and then start to break down my thoughts on what everyone's saying here. So Rasmus says, I learned Scandinavian languages. I confuse their pronunciations. So that's getting to the issue of interference. Hello, thank you for putting this on. I wrote some notes about this beforehand. And the question is, what is the intent in learning multiple languages at once? So we covered a series of different intents here. And that's actually what I want to focus on really, is this idea of intention and goal and being able to have a very clearly defined goal to guide your studies. Dennis said, I speak French at an advanced level. I am now learning Spanish. I find that when I use French, speakers on the internet who teach Spanish, it seems to reinforce both languages. Okay, that's interesting. So kind of the opposite of interference. How can learning multiple languages reinforce and weave or reinforce certain aspects of learning? That's also a true thing. So I'll go into detail about that. I'll go a few more things here. Cool. All right, and Incredible Man has a nice piece of wisdom here, which is when you chase two rabbits, you catch none. Just one at a certain level, then start another. Great. So yeah, that's usually my default advice. However, you know, even just the 5 people on this call or 4 people on this call right now have interesting situations, and I think there actually is a way you can intelligently approach each of these things. So let me just make sure I remember write down these concepts before I forget what they were that I want to cover. And first, I want to start with a few stories or a few kind of anecdotes. One is just to get it out of the way, going off of what Incredible Matt had mentioned, which is the idea that you know, you chase 2 rabbits and you don't catch either. There's like a famous kind of story or a legend about like Warren Buffett, where like his pilot or his driver had asked him like, oh, what's the key to being successful? And he says like, okay, well, I want you to think really hard this week and think about the top 10 things you want to accomplish in your life. And then bring that to me. So the guy thinks about it really hard and he's like, okay, I want to do this, I want to do this. And he reflects really deeply and has his top 10 things to do in life. And then he comes, he's like, okay, Mr. Buffett, this is what it is. I absolutely need to achieve these things before I die. This is my main focus. And he's like, great. So I want you to go through items 3 through 10, and that becomes your list of things to avoid at all costs, right? Because all that matters is 1, 2, 3. And those things are going to be the ones that get in the way of you actually achieving anything, because to achieve a really big thing takes a lot of work. And so, for example, same thing in language, right? It takes a lot of work to become fluent in a foreign language. And if you're trying to chase all those rabbits, then it might not happen for one of them. And that Warren Buffett story is about, it's not just, okay, I have to focus on this, but sometimes we'll be so curious and so have such a strong desire to learn and connect with the other groups of people that it becomes very difficult to sacrifice that desire in the time being. So it's really important to not just have clear goals and intentions, but to also kind of acknowledge these other goals are going to somehow interfere with these ones, and kind of just take that stance of just sacrifice on that. That being said, I just want to get that out the way. You know, we're all I think in general, language learners are very curious and open people, and we want to just talk to everyone and embrace and love everyone. So that's definitely a good ambition to have. Now, what all these people who mentioned, we have Brian, Brendan, Dennis, and Nikki. In each of their stories, they had, for each language that they were discussing, a specific goal or intention, all right? And I want to kind of dissect what those goals are, because when you have that very clearly defined, then it'll allow you to make better decisions in terms of structuring your study time. So we'll start with Brendan. If you just repeat yours, Brendan, or I'll repeat it and let me know if I got it, if I remembered it correctly. You are geographically located in Italy. you previously learned, actually I don't remember, either German or French, and then there's a third language. What was it, your thing again?
Yeah, I'm conversational in Scottish Gaelic,
Okay,
but I was learning German up until the point I realized I was moving to Italy, and then I switched. But I put a lot of time into German, but I didn't quite make it to the shift where I could, let it lay dormant without losing it.
okay, great. So let's translate that into the simple goals. We have German, Scottish Gaelic, and Italian, right? So you guys hear me say all the time that language is just a tool for connecting with people. So if you focus on the people element, that makes it much more clearer what you need to do. So what would the people goal for you be for Italian? That's the easiest one.
Yeah, it's just be able to talk to the locals and get things done, official things done in the language.
Cool. All right. So we can even break it down. That's actually kind of, you can have this kind of two different goals here. So get things done. What are kind of things that you find yourself struggling with getting done on a regular basis in Italy?
Yeah, just making sure you can get your health card, your permit to stay card, and even just setting up a mobile phone contracts and all that.
Okay, cool. So you have a bunch of kind of, bureaucratic procedures or just kind of practical things that you need to get done, and you're running into walls there, and it's kind of, frustrating you there. Beyond that, so that's your one. So essentially, you want to get to a point where you're functional in the Italian society, and you don't have to have that anxiety of like, oh, I need to get this thing done, but I don't know if my Italian's up to par yet to actually succeed in it. That's kind of one goal. Do you have anything Italy-wise? Is Italy purely functional, or is there also goals and desires there in terms of cultural connection or friends or anything?
Yeah, of course, I would like to meet native speaker friends and just complete my assimilation into the culture.
All right, great. Cool. So cultural assimilation, and then you have the functional kind of competence, right? Functional proficiency in the language. And then for German, how far, what was at your peak level of German, what were you able to manage in a conversation?
And I think I was maybe about a month away from getting to where I could have comfortable, simple conversations. I could talk about general things, but not comfortably. I was always searching for what I needed to say. And so I was close, but just didn't quite make it there.
Cool. Okay. And then for Scottish Gaelic, what was your level?
I'm comfortably conversational on that. And I'm not high level, like high B or whatever, but I can talk about most things without much trouble or revision, I think.
Okay. And who do you speak Scottish Gaelic with?
I have some friends I Skype with, from the States, and I've actually got a friend that speaks German and Gaelic, so she was my original contact for German and Gaelic, but now we'll probably just speak Gaelic with each other.
And these are friends that you just want to stay in contact with regardless.
Right. Correct. Right? Yeah.
Cool. All right. So here's how I would think through it in your situation. I would focus. I would write down a list of kind of functional scenarios in Italian that I seek to dominate, right? And like, all right, I'm gonna go in there and I'm gonna get the best mobile cell phone deal ever, right? And then that's where you kind of do your study, your preparation. We talk about script training. You rehearse and prepare ahead of time what it is you're gonna do. And then you write down those situations where it's like, all right, I'm going to the store, the market to buy food every couple of days. I need to do these errands. And then you kind of limit your goal to Italian to just getting to a point where you can confidently function in Italy and interact with the infrastructure there. And then just focus your Italian goals on that simply. Then this German one, I could sense that feeling of like, you don't want to lose it, because it is true. We talked about the shift in losing stuff. So until you get to the point where you can comfortably, spontaneously converse with someone, then the language the training you've done is not going to be fully integrated and stick there. Once you get to that point, then it has a really long half-life for the language to kind of deteriorate. So for example, I haven't spoken Chinese in a long time, but my brother's wife is Chinese. She was here for like holidays, and so they're speaking, and then actually her friend was here as well. So there's two Chinese people, And I started speaking. I'm like, oh, I'm like kind of rusty or whatever. But then after like 2 or 3 days of being around it and hearing it and mimicking it, I'm like, oh yeah, I remember that word. I remember that word. And then it kind of thinks, so there's actually something there to be reactivated, right? But I have a few languages that like I tried for a couple of weeks and then just completely forgot about. And then those, they don't really get reactivated anymore. So it sounds like your German is at the level where with a little final push on it, you can get to that level where you can relax and then reactivate it later. So for that one, I would actually put the bulk of my energy in like, boom, schedule ahead of time, like just mat time, all your series of conversations where you just keep working and pushing hard and really pushing yourself. You know, I would set that goal as like elapsed minutes of conversation. So it's like, all right, I want to have, 5 more hours of conversation, over the next couple of weeks or whatever, and then just schedule those out. And then it's worked into your day in between you running around, getting cell phones in Italy and all that kind of stuff. And like, boom, I got my German conversation. And Italy's just purely business, right? And then this is your kind of thing. And then you get to that point where you feel comfortable. And then for Scottish Gaelic, since you've already reached that shift, it seems, you're not going to lose it anytime soon. And you actually have the perfect situation where it's already embedded into friendships and relationships that you're going to maintain and have anyways. So I would just make a kind of rule for myself, like, oh, well, next time I speak with this person who speaks Scottish Gaelic, just make sure I don't waste the opportunity to practice my Scottish and Gaelic. You know what I'm saying? So that's that. So I think, how does that kind of general framing work for you?
Yeah, that makes sense. I think, although I think I might have fled on, I think my German slipped more than I led you to believe, because I think it'd take, at this point, because it's been since early in the summer where I stopped with it, that I think it'd probably take a bit more of a push.
Yeah, well, actually, if you haven't spoken in a while, the tendency is to underestimate how much we know, because when it's not front of mind, it feels like, man, I don't know any of this German. But you'll be surprised if you just committed to like an intense week of like speaking every day. By the third day, you'll be like, oh yeah, I remember this. And once again, I always bring about general principles of learning. And I use jujitsu a lot because much of my ideas for language learning come from my experience learning jujitsu. So I've been out of jujitsu for years. I just got back into it, several weeks ago, like a month ago. And it's only the past week or so that I'm like, boom, I'm starting to like go back into the flow. And it's an interesting experience because you get to a position, same way you get to a certain position in a conversation. And then you're kind of like, you have like this weird kind of, memento flashback of like, wait a minute, I've been here before. Like I know what to do, but then you don't quite know what to do. And then you come back there and then all of a sudden your arm starts moving. You're like, oh yeah, this thing, So you just kind of have to really spend time there. And there's a big emotional kind of barrier of like, oh man, I remember that I used to know how to do this. And then it's also really depress you that you at that moment in time don't. But if you just stick with it, then all these things start to kind of reactivate and re-come up. So that's how I do it. I would schedule my actual deliberate practice around German. And then because Italian's gonna happen anyways, the functional things, just focusing on that and leaving the cultural assimilation a bit for later. And then for Scottish Gaelic, just like, don't worry about it.
Right. Yeah.
Whenever it comes up, you take care of it. Cool. Is that?
Thanks. Yep. That sounds good.
All right. Thanks, Brendan. Cool. So I want to go off of Brendan's thing and generalize it for everybody else here. What was I doing there? You have different kind of elements to setting your goal. In Brendan's case, we had one of geography and exposure. So because he's already in Italy and it's gonna be happening anyways, then you can set kind of situational rules that are like, oh, well, in this situation that's gonna appear all the time or frequently anyways, what are my rules of engagement? So he's already gonna be speaking with friends who speak Scottish Gaelic. So the rule is don't waste the opportunity. He's already gonna be going to buy, groceries and other things. So the rule is like, each time I go there, make an attempt to pick up a new word or that kind of stuff. So you have these kind of situational goals where it's like, this is already part of my life. So let me just make sure I do at least the minimum thing not to waste the opportunities. And then that's separate from the more kind of going beyond yourself, deliberate practice, deliberate intentional training goals. Like no one's speaking German around here. If I don't do the work, I'm not going to get that German practice. So let me like schedule out time of my day dedicated to bringing my German to a specific level so that I don't lose it for good, right? So we're going to apply the same kind of framework to everyone else here. But before I go to that, I want to answer some questions that came up. Okay, Jeff was saying, I was in Portugal last month, but I kept saying gracias instead of obrigado. Yeah, don't worry about that. So the most frequent form of interference are going to be the words that we say the least consciously. So for example, excuse me, thank you, yeah, right. Those words are just so unconscious that like those are always going to be the ones that interfere and slip in. I remember I learned Spanish first, then I learned Chinese. And I remember I came back from China, I was in the US, and there's this Mexican guy on the street who was lost and he was asking for directions. And I saw that he was Mexican because he couldn't speak English that well. And I started giving him directions in Spanish. And then we're walking together and he's telling me something. And I understand him perfectly, but I kept responding like, dui, sure. And like I kept responding like the word in Chinese for okay. And he just kind of looking at me like, what's this guy saying? Like, what is this word he's saying? And I kept like, why do you keep saying that? And it's interesting because even though I knew I was saying it, I couldn't stop myself because I just got back from China like a day earlier. So it was so deeply ingrained in my motor memory to just make that sound whenever people talk to me. So those things take a while to go away. I wouldn't worry about that kind of interference. Dennis says, to me, the most critical thing is to develop the ability to think in the language. I find that if I create immersion bubbles with YouTube, where you have only the foreign language with subtitles, that works very well for me. Yeah, and this idea of thinking. So the thank you, obrigado, doi thing I mentioned before, that's kind of more an unconscious motor memory in your mouth, and that'll resolve itself. The interference we're really worried about is the thinking interference. I think we'll go to Dennis next. I think you mentioned this in your case where you'll find yourself trying to speak French, but you're thinking in Spanish. Tell us a bit more about that. We'll talk about how to unpack the interference problems.
Okay. Well, as you said, it was basically a very unconscious reaction. So that, like in the past, when my Spanish was a lot better, you know, I would be, and for some strange reason, even though I'd be speaking Spanish to Spanish speakers, I'm just suddenly thinking and speaking a few French words, and vice versa. Currently, because my focus is more on French, yeah, that isn't happening. And I think it's largely because I'm more in a French-English environment as opposed to, you know, a Spanish environment. You know, interestingly enough, since we spoke last weekend, I have actually joined a sort of informal French workshop. Nice. Where it isn't one-on-one because the guy has up to 10 persons in his session, and he's fluent in French, and he's also fluent in Spanish. So I'm going to be using that as my opportunity to practice my Spanish. In addition to that, in my classes, there are students who are from Spanish-speaking countries. So I have used that as an opportunity. I wouldn't say to really and truly practice my Spanish because we really don't have too much time to converse, but I would use, you know, just a few moments in time just to, you know, practice a few phrases, at least to keep, you know, the Spanish brain stimulated. So in terms of interference at present, it's not as it used to be in the past, when both my French and Spanish were a little more active in each of the cases. So that's what I'm currently experiencing. Okay, cool. So yeah, I want to tell you guys a series of stories and kind of piece together the way I think about language, and it applies to your situation as well as I'm going to transition to Nikki's situation as well. Oh, Idahosa, may I just interrupt you one moment again? Quickly, sometime last year, I did an online course, one of those MWC courses, which dealt, and this particular topic was on the bilingual brain. Fascinating topic because it showed you how the brain operates when you are learning a language as a young person, as opposed to an older person. And it is amazing that as an older person, when you're learning a language, different parts of the brain are actually in operation, as opposed to someone who is younger. So that, and one of the things that stood out with me is that as an older learner, you look for connections in the language or languages that you are familiar with to help you understand or learn the current language. And I find it to be extremely useful. Having done that online course, I'm deliberately, not going to be harassed by the fact that, I can't remember the conjugations, although it does, bother me from time to time. But I'm more conscious of the fact that another part of my brain is in operation as opposed to when I was learning Spanish when I was much younger. Mm-hmm. So knowing that, has actually helped me to be not as hard on myself as I would normally have been. So just to recap, the course is called the Bilingual Brain. Excellent, excellent program, which I would encourage everyone, if they have a chance, even if it's to audit that course. But so it helps you to really realize that as an older person, you aren't using the same, brain cells as a younger person. And as I said, it really helps you to appreciate the fact that, your learning ability or the process is not only somewhat different, it's quite different as an older person. For sure. So I just wanted to add that as well.
Yeah, and actually goes to the first story I wanted to tell, actually, which is of children learning. So I was speaking to someone yesterday who lives in Germany, and she's American, but her and as is her husband and as is her children, but they are living in Germany. So her small children are growing up in Germany, and they, within a year they already speak German. And I was talking to her about her experience of her daughter, in first grade in Germany, and her teacher had told her that very quickly, she picked up the language very quickly, and it wasn't until like the end of the year that she had realized that they were speaking German. So she was having conversations and understanding directions, and the teacher would tell people what to do, and she'd go along and follow. But she didn't actually make the conscious distinction that these were English and German were two different languages. Which to an adult is like, well, how is that possible? Because we think of things in such clear boundaries and borders. When it gets back to what Mimic Method is, it's that language is just a tool, and it's just sounds. It's just a connection between sounds and meaning. And a meaning is just a story, it's an implication for action. If you haven't seen it yet, I posted a video on YouTube yesterday called How Meaning Emerges. You can watch that after this. And I make a distinction between understanding something versus translating. So off basically what Dennis is saying, when you already have a whole meaning network in English, for example, as an adult, and you're going to learn Italian or French or or Turkish or whatever it may be, what you tend to want to do is make a connection between these English words and the Turkish words, the English words and the German words, right? What I try to do, when I try to guide people how to do, is how to bypass your English brain and just connect directly to the story, connect directly to the meaning at hand, and forge that connection between the sound and the meaning naturally. So what do I mean by that? What was I gonna say? So, so I'll tell you an interesting story. When I was in Montreal learning French, and one of the reasons why I went to Montreal is because it was a multilingual society, and not just that people spoke different languages, but that people mixed and weaved the languages together in a very natural, intuitive way. So you have people who are in Montreal who, their parents are Quebecois, but they have English friends, and then vice versa. And you'd hear these conversations where people would be like, yes, yesterday, j'étais avec mon frère, and then like they would start like mixing within a sentence, switch from English to French. And I'm like, wow, it's so cool. Like, what? And then sometimes if you're like an immigrant kid, you'll put in like Spanish as well, or like, if you're Haitian, you put in like Creole. And it was just this big melange of different stuff. And I was trying to figure out what the system was, what was the algorithm, what was like the formula. And I remember one day I was at a bar and I was eavesdropping on a conversation between two women, and they're speaking, and they're going back and forth. And once again, every 2 seconds, they both be switching from French to English. It wasn't that one spoke French and one spoke English. It was that they were both speaking both. And I was trying to figure out at the moments of switching, like, why did you switch? Is there some kind of pattern where, like, in French, you switch on these kind of words, and in English, but there was no pattern. I'm like, there's no pattern here. I cannot see for life of me what the pattern is here. So I turn around, I'm like, sorry, I was eavesdropping on you guys, but I gotta know. Right now, you just switched from this word to that word, from English to French. Why? What was going on in your mind? What made you decide that you want to do it in French? And then she told me something which completely changed the way I saw language. And what she said is that, well, even though we both speak French and English, I'm primarily Anglophone, she's primarily Francophone. And when I get to a word that just comes to me more naturally in English, I'll say that word in English, even if I was already speaking French. Or if I get to a word or a meaning that I know is going to resonate with her more deeply in French, because she's French, I'll say the French word. And then I realized when she said that, like, oh, this is how we speak no matter what the language is. Because when I'm speaking to you guys in English right now, a part of me is thinking about how you're going to receive what I'm saying. And I'm not going to make a reference to, like, you know, my best friend's, favorite, video game, in this conversation, because you guys don't know my best friend and you don't know his favorite video game. So that reference doesn't mean anything to you, right? So I'm constantly aware of what our shared experiences are and what our shared references are, and I'm playing within that. But if I knew that you also spoke, Spanish, or if I knew that you also came from a Nigerian American background or whatever, I would expand my references, right? Like Dennis, I know you see Caribbean, you speak English, but if you're speaking English with someone from, wherever you're from in the Caribbean, you would probably use different words and you'd reference different places, and things would expand that way, right?
Yeah.
And the idea is that, like, when you start to think about it that way, and then you start to communicate that way, things get interesting. So now I want to move to Nikki, because Nikki, in your situation, you're in a very complex multilingual environment where you have, you're in the grander culture of Turkey, but then you have these different Kurdish groups that you're communicating with. I'm curious, to what degree do people mix the languages when they're speaking, or at least mix Turkish into what they're saying, if at all?
They do quite a lot. In fact, I actually live in Albania and function in Albanian,
Oh, there you go.
which has helped me with all 3 languages, basically with the vocabulary. One useful thing is all my Kurdish friends know Turkish. So if by any chance I don't know a word in Kurdish and happen to know it in Turkish, I can use that. And my teacher, my Zazaki teacher, teaches me almost entirely in Zazaki, but sometimes when I don't understand something, he'll go either into English, which he knows less than I do Turkish, or he'll go into Turkish. And in fact, in Turkey, Kormanji uses a lot of Turkish words, whereas Kormanji in Syria puts in a lot of Arabic words.
Yeah, so this is exactly what I want to get into, and it relates to what Dennis was saying about children learning, which is that, first off, those of us in, especially in the Americas, if you live in the US, Canada, Mexico, Brazil, Latin America, anywhere, we have a what's the word for it? We have an inaccurate view of how language works geographically and culturally. because what happened was you had the different European groups come to the Americas, and then they brought, it was a specific group of like Spaniards, or a specific group of people from the British Isles came, and then their language spread across the entire continent, right? But if you go to any place in the old world, be it in Europe or Asia or Africa, a very small distance of land covered, then you're already switching language, right? And then these groups are interweaving, and there's so much mixing going on that the natural state of affairs is that within a place the size of, say, the state of Texas, you're going to have 200 different languages all interweaving in a kind of crazy way. And there's also an element of education and formalization of language that makes us think we have these very clean line borders between things. So, Charles is asking, how does the brain know that these different languages are separate? And the thing is that the way it knows is it doesn't. That's not how it works. So I brought the story up with my friend's daughter. She didn't even know she was speaking German, right? And my nieces live in Texas, and they grew up bilingual, English and Spanish. And I used to mess with them when they were like 2 and 3, because I would come and their mom speaks English, I'm her sister, and I speak English, or we're speaking English. So they had just subconsciously dropped me into the bucket of like the English people. They don't have the word English people. It's just kind of like when they see my face, certain sounds come out of it, and then they just know they want to get cookies from me. Then they got to make the same sounds I'm making. They got to mimic me. And then all of a sudden, if I come and I say like, "Hey, Sofia, ¿cómo estás? ¿Todo bien?" And then I always mess with her a lot, and then she look at me and like, and then her, I can see her brain starting to like forge new kind of things. Like, wait a minute, like this guy is defying my expectations. I mean, and she understands what I'm saying, but she's like, wait, I'm supposed to speak to you that way? Like, that's kind of not supposed to what's going to happen, right? So it's not an explicit thing. We just make associations to context. So anyways, I brought that up with Nikki's case because since my trip in Montreal, I was experimenting with stuff where, I was in Brazil once, and I meet people who are fluent in English because they lived abroad or they spoke really good English, but we were speaking Portuguese. And then I would just start mixing in English words. Whenever a word came to me in English, I would like, screw it, I'm just gonna say it in English. And then, I wanna say the Portuguese word, and then it just kind of felt right. And the person's like, what are you doing? And I'm like, well, I'm just mixing English and Portuguese. And they're like, what are you doing? And then it was super interesting because after 5 minutes, they would start doing it themselves, right? And the idea is this, I'm not doing a good job explaining this, but the idea is that there's no such thing as language. There's just communication between humans and sounds. So, in Nikki's case, you're speaking to all these people. If your goal is just to communicate and get your point across, to express yourself as honestly as possible, and to understand, get that person to express him or herself as honestly as possible, you start to invent your own language. You start to invent your own form of expression. And I think an actual more natural path of learning in these kind of multilingual environments is to just do that. And then over time, just like my niece, who's now like, 8 or 9, she's now learned how to make this, clear boundaries between things. So now she's in a formal Spanish education and a formal English education. She can make those clear boundaries, but that didn't happen until she was able to just get her point across no matter who she's speaking to. So, and it's actually more fun in my opinion. Like if you just focus on like, I'm gonna throw in English, I'm gonna throw in Turkish, I'm gonna throw in Kurdish, and then people are gonna start liking you like, oh, this woman's crazy. She's just throwing it all in there. But remember that story I told you about Montreal. There's only 2 rules. Are you able to express yourself? And is that person able to understand what you're expressing? And it's between those 2 guidelines that language evolves. And then all the rules and the standards and the grammar, who cares about that kind of stuff? Like, if they get you and you get them, that's a success. That's how you should measure yourself, not by what like the Academy of Perfect French in Paris is saying about such and such, right? So I'm gonna ask Nikki what your thoughts are on that. And I'm gonna move to Brian because in your case it's different. you do need to care about the rules if they're going to be if the actual Academy of French is going to be grading your abilities. But Nikki, what are your thoughts on that, and how's it relate to your experience?
Many of my Kurdish friends are passionate about their language.
Mm-hmm.
So, and they appreciate the fact that I'm taking the trouble to learn it, even though I make mistakes. In fact, one of them, a Zaza, actually got in touch with me because he was feeling depressed because Zaza don't bother to know their mother tongue, let alone use it. And he was looking on YouTube to see what he could find. And he said, he found one of my videos and he said, I was so moved to see a foreigner struggling to express herself in our mother tongue that even other Zazas don't bother with. So I think it's important to use the language when I can. And people are very, very forgiving about lack of grammar, wrong words, and all the rest.
That's great. Yeah, and that gets back to what I was saying too, right? Where the like that Montreal conversation I was eavesdropping on, it's expressing yourself and then being aware of what that person knows and trying to make them. So for example, like I said, in that conversation between those girls in Montreal, they both knew the English word and they both knew the French word. The girl chose to use the one that would resonate most with the person she was speaking to. And then we have a natural sense of when people are doing that. And what that communicates underneath the word is that the person cares about us. And us is our personal story, but also the culture we're a part of and the things that are important to us. So in Nikki's case, you're speaking with this person and like, yeah, maybe I know the word in English, I know the word in Turkish, but I say like, hey, how do I say this in your language? How would you say this? And they say it. And I'm like, oh, then I mimic it. And then I look for ways to bring it back into conversation. I'm looking for inside jokes, looking for those things. And this is really how you connect and bond with people. And I always say it, one of my lines is, we're all different colors, different shapes, all that kind of stuff, but we all have the same mouth. So if you learn how to pronounce it and sound like them, you'll be amazed at how much you can break down all those more superficial barriers between us when you can really tell a joke about someone's home, that only people in a person's hometown knows in like their dialect. And I don't care what they think about you or the people you're from, they're like, whoa, you know that? And all of a sudden you're like one of their best friends in the world, especially in the case like Nikki was talking about where the person's feeling that their culture is shrinking. And if they're an island in a larger culture or the next generation isn't really engaging it anymore, then it becomes a very strong emotional connection point. So once again, it's not about the grammar. It's not about that. It's about making the person feel listened to, making the person feel cared about and heard. And when you really lock into that, that's what I try to teach people in this program. When you really lock into those things, all the technical details start to solve themselves. But I find people have difficulty connecting to that deeper emotional layer first. So cool. Thank you, Nikki, for sharing your story. That's pretty cool. I'm excited that you show up first on Google results for for this language. You should maybe start a side business off of that. Cool, Brian. We'll end with you. Sorry, you have something to say, Nikki?
Can I just something?
Yeah.
In Albania, I live in a village, and when I'm in the village, I will normally use the words and the less educated people, the words they use in the village.
Yeah.
And sometimes friends in town tell me off for this.
Yeah.
I can actually speak very good literary Albanian when I want to. And if I'm in a sort of group of intellectuals, I very likely will. But when I'm in the village, I definitely try to use the language we use here, which in fact
Yeah.
a lot of it comes from Turkish, interestingly.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up actually, because that's another example of an important point, which is that there's no such thing. When I think what's the right language or even what's the right accent, and people always ask me that question, what's the right, what's the proper form of Spanish to learn, the proper French, and I said, the best version of the language to learn is the one that's spoken by the person you're looking at in the conversation at that moment, right? Like you just want to mimic those people. Because, for example, French and Quebecois, French people, when they meet people from Quebec, they're like, oh, this is not French, and they'll get like kind of like snooty about it, and Quebec people they're like, and the thing is, like, I'll do both. Like I'll listen to what people do and start to just kind of blend into what they're doing. Because to me, I know you're just making sounds with your mouth. Like how can one be better how could one way of going be better than the other one? It's always kind of like made up in the end of the day anyway. So like, you don't want to go down to the neighborhood here and speak with like Queen's English, to like working class people, nor would I want to go and present my doctoral thesis, with like slang, right? It's just every conversation has a goal. And I just want to be aware of what that goal is and then use whatever I have at my disposal to attack that goal as quickly as possible. So once again, it gets back to that general conversation of stop thinking about languages. It's not that, it's about people. And then we just have sounds that we use to connect with people. So that's really good. I'm glad you brought that up, Nikki. Cool. So Brian, I'm gonna move on to you now. I wanted to just kind of end talking about, once again, the goals, getting really clear on what the goal is for you with German and French, and then reverse engineering your study plan to make sure you can attack that goal as efficiently as possible.
Okay. Well, but I know that I really need to, study, and try to perhaps find some language partners, on the web. That's very nerve inducing for me, just meeting random people and just chattering, especially in a foreign language.
Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes I have difficulty doing that in my own language.
Sure.
And I know that I need to do these things. I need to, I guess, open my wallet, to find some language partners on italki or Verbling.
Sure. Well, I'll tell you what, since it's anxiety inducing to you, the way everyone has things that we have that gives us anxiety, right? Because it's like, oh, I don't want to do this, and there's a resistance to doing it. And then the strategy for approaching it is always to break things down into smaller pieces based on what your goals are. And then that way, the actual courage and willpower you need to confront it gets lessened. So let's reverse engineer from your goals here. I'm trying to understand, for your thing, you're doing a doctoral thesis in German history?
Yes.
And which is going to require you to read things in German. And then there's also, in order for you to get your PhD in the end, is there going to be some kind of German exam that's testing your oral fluency and whatnot?
No, because the dissertation will speak for itself.
Mm-hmm.
That I've been able to read and research the documents. But during the actual application process to get into a university doctoral program, they will want to know that I can read and speak some German, because I will have to go to Germany, and live there for a bit, research the archives, maybe even take a class or so at a German university. That's, and of course, wherever I go, I'll be interacting with the locals.
Mm-hmm.
So I will have to actually, speak the language.
Sure.
And like you said, speak well enough so that I'm understood.
Yeah.
And ideally, hopefully without actually just bulldozing into English all the time.
Sure.
Because I have to keep in mind that whoever I'm speaking to might not know a word of English.
Yeah.
And you have to do the best you can to make yourself understood.
Sure.
And also, I'm hard of hearing.
Okay.
So some of the nuances of sound will evade me, especially if you talk with your back to me. That happens even in English. Yeah. And that's why I had so much difficulty speaking French. I was able to read it decently enough for school, but there's so many silent words that there was a disconnect between the spoken French and the written French.
Yeah.
So that was very difficult. I mean, I took a 2-week trip to Nantes, France, and stayed with a host family. And we spoke French and English. They knew some English, you know, and I told the coordinator this very clearly, that I'm having a lot of problems speaking French. You know, if I have a host family that knows French and English, you know, things will go pretty well. And it did. And they were very helpful, you know, when I spoke French, you know, gently correcting me when French words were way wrong. So it worked out pretty well there.
And have you taken any of my courses?
I've tried the mimic method on the German, especially. I don't think I actually got to the French, but I did try it with the German, you know, especially with the umlauts.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, you know, we're launching a new series of courses, and then there's going to be like a free version of it as well. And I'd say in your combining the fact that if you combine the fact that you're
excuse me, I have a phone call. Can you give me just 1 minute?
Yeah, no worries. I'll speak actually.
Hello.
Audience here.
Right now I'm listening to a webinar. Can you give me a few minutes?
All right. Cool. So all right, great. So I want to say specifically in your case, and we'll wrap it up with this this idea. Someone was asking about reinforcement versus interference. So you mentioned interference before. It's going to happen on a motor level where, you know, I'm saying thank you in this language when I should be saying in this one. Don't worry about that one. What could be problematic is in speaking and interference in trying to communicate your thoughts if you're stuck in the realm of a different language. If you are living in a multilingual context and you just keep practicing that, eventually you do what interpreters do, and then you'll start to kind of compartmentalize the different languages and contexts in your mind as it becomes relevant in your life. So that's interference. There is a reinforcement element to learning multiple languages. However, it only, in my experience, occurs at the level of hearing and pronunciation. So what it is we use the same mouth to create the sounds. And the whole point of my method is we go really deep into detail on understanding how sounds are created, and then training and fine-tuning your pronunciation, fine-tuning your hearing there. Now, Brian, in your case, you said two things to me. One is that you're learning reading and writing in German, so you're going deep into, like, you know, the archives. And if you said you're hard of hearing as well, your biggest barrier by far in a conversational context is going to be actually capturing and receiving the signal from the speakers. So doing that in the German context and the French context, those are going to reinforce, especially those two languages, because they have lots of similarities from a pronunciation point of view. Yeah, you know, these new courses, especially the free one, and there's going to be a French course coming out soon as well, German a little bit later, but the general techniques are going to be laid out for everybody for free to learn. Really dedicating time, since you're already going to be reading for your thesis, really dedicating time to fine-tuning your hearing in either of these languages is going to go a long way for you. And that's going to involve practices like, once again, scheduling deliberate practice hours where you sit down and you're just, you know, breaking down a natural speech recording sound by sound. And you're like, oh, he's making this sound. And basically think about like a magnifying glass or like a zooming thing. The further down into detail you zoom and really hear what's going on, the further deeper down into your brain and your kind of auditory cortex these associations are made. So then when you zoom back out and you're in a thing where, you know, people are speaking not so clearly, or they're not speaking directly at you, you now have more unconscious software to kind of fill in the blanks and guess. Because hearing is two things, partly physical, partly neurological, in the sense that you're receiving the signal, but you'll be surprised at how much we're actually filling in the blanks with our own pattern recognition systems. So that
I can do that with English. You know, sometimes I can make a reasonable guess, you know, what the person is saying.
Exactly. So yeah, that ability to understand English, like your physical capacity to hear English is the same as it is in French or whatever, or any other language.
Yeah.
Just that the kind of pattern recognition system underneath it is way more highly developed in English. So developing that in your German context and French is going to be the best use of your time there.
Okay.
Cool. So anyways, we're about 5 minutes over now. I'm going to just finish up here by looking at people's questions on YouTube, and then
I think you muted your microphone.
there you go. Thanks, buddy. I'm glad someone said it. All right, great. So I was reading here. So BH Watch has said language mixing of which you speak is known as code switching, a thoroughly studied sociolinguistic and cognitive phenomenon. Yes, that's a technical term for what it is. Code switching is usually used in the context in the U.S. of typically like African American communities and the English to speak there versus the general broader public. I personally grew up in a very diverse neighborhood, so I was code switching all the time as a kid. You know, between school and hanging out, playing basketball with my friends and whatnot. So, and I have, you know, Nigerian mom and friends as well, and there's a different way of speaking there. So that idea, if you already grow up in a kind of mixed culture background, then you already kind of have an intuition of what it means to adapt your form of speak to the context at hand. But it's a general phenomenon, so no matter where you are, just developing an awareness of how what you're saying is being determined by whom you're speaking to. I think if you just pay attention to that, even like between like talking to your parents and talking to your friends, you know, I guess it depends on what your relationship is. I happen to be someone who I put lots of value in speaking respectively to my parents and other people. So, you know, there's certain words, specifically curse words, I would just never use in front of my mom or my dad or whatever. But, you know, I might use with my friends here. I wouldn't use it on a context like this as well. Just paying attention to how certain things and certain ways of saying things change in your context, and then tapping into that, and then applying that to the foreign language context. Once again, we're drawing way too many borders around things. It's a much more fluid, flowy thing than people realize as adults. And I'll answer that last question here. How do you define fluent as opposed to being conversational? Good question. So the terms I would use are spontaneous conversation, that point that Brendan and I were speaking about of the shift is about I'm able to enter a conversation, get my point across, understand what that guy's point is, and feel comfortable in the conversation. So I define it as a point when a conversation no longer sucks. I no longer feel that anxiety beforehand entering into it. I no longer have those periods where I'm like stuttering for like 30 seconds long, like, and I'll just get stuck. I don't have the experience of, man, I really want to say this thing or get this point across, but I don't have the words to do so, and that's frustrating. Like, that's conversational. I don't have to worry about those things. But in between that and fluent, I'm still sloppy. I'm still making grammar mistakes. I'm still struggling to get it out. It's just that I succeed. I'm struggling. I succeed, but I struggle. Whereas fluent is just, I succeed without struggling. right now I'm not struggling to communicate with you in English because I'm fluent, right? So fluent comes from the word fluid, of flow, right? It just, it's a remark on, it's a reference to the absence of friction. So things are able to just kind of flow fluidly and fluently out of me because the channels have been smoothed. And that just comes from the process of, most importantly, repeated practice and time in the context, is doing it over and over again until you feel comfortable. And then there's also ways you can accelerate it through a refinement process of kind of pinpointing the things that you're doing wrong and then focusing on that in a very deliberate way. But we won't get into that. That's a different, maybe that's our next live discussion call. How do we get into the refinement and smoothing process of going from conversational to fluent? But I tend to focus on getting people to conversational because that's where all the fun happens. And going from that to fluent takes a lot more work. And you got to really want it. But just getting to the point where you can just connect the conversation makes so much. And I'm glad, Nikki, you joined us today because, your stories of being in Albania or speaking to different groups of people. And like, even if it's just a little bit of the language that you're able to express, communicate, boom, human connections already, flowing immensely. So I'm super happy that you're doing that work out there as well. And I'm super happy you guys joined me. Thank you, Brendan. Thank you, Dennis. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Nikki. Thank you, everyone on YouTube, for joining. And I hope you guys get to join next time. Any final comments here? Nikki? Anyone else? All right, cool. All right, thanks, guys. Thanks for watching. And if you want to watch the replay, you can just watch it on YouTube. And stay tuned. Join the email list if you haven't, to know about the next one and to send in your questions. And then also, if you haven't subscribed to YouTube channel yet, please do so. Our goal is to get to 10,000 by April 1st. All right. Thanks, guys. Take care.
Right. Bye.
Bye.